Today I am joined by Matthew Harvey. Matt, thank you for joining me.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So you're someone who I know is at least somewhat interested in free speech. You were instructor of a free speech and dangerous ideas course I actually wasn't involved in. And to start this off, because we seem to have this weird perception around free speech, at least in America, what does free speech mean? I know that's vague, but our perception of free speech in America is it's constitutional, but that constitution doesn't apply to the world. So what does that actually mean on a more general level before we dive into specifics?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Free speech, the tie between free speech and democracy is something that has really become a uniquely American concept. One of the comments I received at the conclusion of last semester from a number of students was, why didn't we talk about, the role of free speech in other democratic countries? And a key reason why that is because, in most other democratic regimes, free speech isn't something that is enumerated as like a constitutional right or civil liberty. It's something where the notion of speech that's, is totally immune from censorship, from regulation of any kind, is something of an anathema. Whereas here in the US, the idea of whether it's the government, whether it's your employer, your neighbor, whoever else, infringing upon your free speech and regulating what you can and cannot say is something that, at least in the minds of the American public, is something that's deeply anti-democratic. And one of the things that I really wanted to tease out of our class that we had was the ways in which free speech isn't really something that historically has been immune to constant contestation. As we talked about with a number of Supreme Court cases, particularly after World War I and the passage of like the Espionage Act, the judiciary took a really strong stance against like what forms of speech were like counterproductive to American democracy, which were socially harmful, and which could be, more strictly regulated or punished by the law. Particularly speech that encouraged, like, in the case of like during World War I, any literature that was disseminated that was arguing for people to burn their draft cards, or like, in other words, not support the war in Europe. Similarly, in the civil rights era, there was a lot of contestation over whether like racist speech or hate speech was something that was constitutionally protected, what actually consists of hate speech, or and what is the government's role in protecting that. So from my personal perspective, one of the things I asked at the end of the semester was, is there such a thing as free speech? And truly, I don't think there is. Whether or not speech is perceived as harmful is something that's really going to depend on the listener. It's going to depend on the social context in which it was uttered. And in the era of social media, that's so difficult to really tease out, because no matter what you post on Facebook, I had a great time at the movie theater, someone somewhere is going to be offended by that in some way, shape, or form. And because discourse is something that has become so impersonal in the era of social media, the importance of assessing the context of speech is something that's so much more difficult to do. And oftentimes, whether or not speech is perceived to be like harmful, or whether or not, the government's like response or any other actor's response to your own speech is considered to be like, an infringement on your civil liberty, it's often like a snap judgment. It's very emotional. Because it's something that in the US we prize so highly, and it's such a messy concept. So again, personally, I don't think there is such a thing as like quote unquote totally free speech. I think all speech is subject to questioning and contestation. Whether or not it should be punishable by law is a different story, but no speech should be held as immune from engagement and immune from debate.
So why is free speech this seemingly requisite absolute in America where it's not in other countries?
In no small part because of the way in which American democracy really deifies the Constitution, right? It's enumerated in the Bill of Rights as one of the cornerstones of like civil liberties, of what it means to be an American. The problem is that oftentimes America's founding and the laws that were set up in the Constitution are held to this sort of gold standard of what it means to be a democracy, what it means to be a developed country. And in reality, much like the Second Amendment, which is something I believe that, should be like revisited in the modern era compared to when it was initially drafted, the notion of free speech as a civil liberty is something that should be constantly revisited and questioned continuously. It shouldn't be held as this like immutable, like overarching law that supersedes all other civil liberties. And that's where at least the Supreme Court really plays a pivotal role in determining like how speech is interpreted by law. But even then, that's not immune to like bias in some way, shape, or form. As we talked about in class, during the passage of the Espionage Act in 1917, when the U.S. was engaged in World War I, the court leaned, more ideologically to the right than it did in like during the Civil Rights era, when there was increasing pushback on the notion of hate speech and what constituted hate speech. Was it burning a cross in your front yard? Was that symbolic act of form of hate speech? Was burning the American flag in protest of the Vietnam War an act of hate speech? And the further you go down these rabbit holes, you also begin to tease apart, like, what actually constitutes a speech? Is it something spoken? Is it like a physical demonstration? Is it a piece of artwork? Like, it's such a tricky concept to define. And that's something that the Constitution does not do in its enumeration of free speech as a civil liberty. So I'd say it's in part, because the American ideology is something that places so much weight on the founding of the country and on the founding fathers and on the Constitution that there's not really a lot of critical inquiry that's being done, particularly in like civics education in this country. Like those types of debates aren't something that we're really taught. It's like, here's the Constitution, here's what it says, here are your rights as an American. And it's sort of left in that sort of ambiguous state.
Well, you mentioned several topics in there that I want to unpack fully. But on the topic of America still, let's say, versus the world, to make this politicized, you mentioned the comparison between America and other democracies and how our free speech is interpreted differently, let's say. But how does that compare to other countries that aren't perceived as democracies? Like, how does someone like China, who we perceive for a lot of reasons as seemingly unfair to their citizens, particularly, let's say, Uyghur Muslims, to go to one extreme, but is their life really as is their life really not as free in terms of free speech as Americans often project onto the world?
I think you really hit the nail on the head with that last comment on what we project onto the rest of the world. You may remember one of the articles that we read in class by Gary King, Jennifer Pan, and Margaret Roberts. This was published in May of 2013 in the American Political Science Review, and it talks about censorship in China. And in the US, there's this perception that China's oftentimes our scapegoat for from COVID to I stubbed my toe or I lost my manufacturing job. There's a way to blame it on China. And there's this misconception that free speech isn't something that exists there and that everything you do and say is monitored and censored in some way, shape, or form. And that these authors prove that that's really not the case. What they found is that more often than not, they were looking at internet posts specifically on, China's closed circuit internet network across 1,400 different social media sites. They found overall that posts that were critical of the government, of the Chinese leadership, of the Chinese Communist Party, were generally left untouched by internet police. When internet police take down a post, they make it clear this is who we are. This is what we're doing. They even have little emojis that they use. And those posts were left untouched. You could be critical of the state however you wanted. Where they would begin to censor more, regardless of context, regardless of whether it was in support or against the government, were comments that tried to spur social mobilization. Whether it's like a student activist group marching in memory of Tiananmen Square, or a group that's in support of an official who was jailed for corruption, or whatever else, when there's a collective mobilization that is the goal of the internet speech, then internet censors would take it down. Still something that's very anti-democratic, but not to the same scale that we often project onto China. One of my favorite examples, John Oliver's show Last Week Tonight had a segment last year where he talked about Xi Jinping and his consolidating power in China. And he said that Winnie the Pooh was, the classic Disney character, was banned in China because citizens were making comparisons between Xi Jinping and Winnie the Pooh and how they looked. So all posts with Winnie the Pooh were taken down and their posters prosecuted, yada, yada. And that's just not the case, because the Walt Disney Corporation has park in mainland China, which has, Winnie the Pooh and the 100-Acre Wood ride. Chinese citizens ride it every day. They don't blur out Winnie the Pooh's face. They're not trying to censor the Walt Disney Corporation. And those types of, and there may have been a couple instances where Chinese police did take down a post that made that comparison, but certainly not to the point where the image was banned in China. But the American media does tend to run away with those types of stories. But you do, the point still stands that free speech isn't something, or free speech is a civil liberty that is often evaluated by political scientists to determine how well a given democracy is functioning, or how whether or not a state can be determined to be democratic or not. That's far from the only civil liberty that is looked at when groups like Polity or Freedom House are making those rankings. Oftentimes, freedom of the press is one that's ranked considerably higher than freedom of speech. But it is something that is part of a broad range of freedoms that we look at to consider how well, or whether or not a society is democratic.
To push back on that a little bit, let's just look at China as a microcosm. Do you think it's possible that this lack of censorship on certain things, aside from collective mobilization, is actually an act to subdue and satiate the remedial desires of the general populace, in some sense actually giving them less freedom, although it's perceived as more?
That's a really good question. I admit I don't have a satisfying answer for that. I will say that, I'm not an international relations scholar. I'm a political theorist. So, this is not the focus of my academic work. What I can say is that, perceptions of China by Chinese citizens are generally positive, in no small part because, so many millions of people have been lifted out of poverty since China began its reform and opening policy in the 1980s and embraced a more market capitalist economy. Although their single party rule is listed as the Chinese Communist Party, their economy is anything but communist. And simply because of that, citizens tend to have a positive perception of the regime. I can't really speak to the motivations of said regime, but they do have a history of trying to limit and suppress citizen mobilization. But I'd argue that the U.S. does that as well, right? We can look towards the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020. Oftentimes when protest marches are organized on Facebook or Twitter or what have you, they have to get a permit from the city. They march along pre-agreed designated routes. Police are often there to ensure that that march is something that does stay within those guidelines. And it's worth questioning, how effective is a protest when it has to be pre-approved? And it's not just Black Lives Matter marches that have had to go through that. A lot of marches in the aftermath of Trump's inauguration in 2016, the Women's March, the March for Science, have gone through similar processes. And it's difficult to see, how those types of collective political actions are truly like disruptive, as their goal is often intended to be, if they have to go through those pre-approved steps. Um, it's hard to see the difference between how, I mean, there are differences, but the differences are blurred a bit when we look at how the US cracks down on protests that operate past their pre-approved hours or deviate from the pre-approved route, uh, versus how China preemptively moderates that organization on social media.
To the point I was just going to bring up, social media seems to have very similar parallels in this conversation. The way, in one perspective, you could say there's a subduing of citizens into their own thought bubbles with those around them who agree with them. You could argue that there's intercession by other countries, let's say in a political election on something like Facebook. There's so many parallels here. The one difference is, and maybe these are intertwined in some way, social media is running in a way that we've never experienced. Sure, social media is new generally, but this algorithmic, psychologically learned experience is one that we don't really understand. I just wonder more generally, do you have a similar fear as I do and have discussed on this podcast that social media could actually be an equally large inhibitor, if not greater inhibitor, of thought-provoking speech than any government intervention would be?
Uh, I would say overall, yes, although probably not for the reasons you think. Oftentimes, social media is something that is argued to be against free speech when a particular actor on a given platform is silenced. Sometimes that's attributed to something like cancel culture or like a gross overreach, or in the case of when Donald Trump was banned from Twitter, like a deep state conspiracy, yada yada. Um, but I think the deeper problem is the role that social media has played in undermining political discourse in this country, and especially in recent electoral cycles, facilitating or aiding and abetting political campaigns in different ways. Part of the reason why social media can operate largely unchecked and unmoderated by the state is because of Section 230 of US telecommunications law. And what that does is it essentially takes internet platforms. This act was written in 1996, like when the internet was still in its infancy, before memes were even a thing. And it made it so internet platforms and providers were not liable for the content that was published by users on that system. That has since opened a lot of debate as to whether or not speech on the internet can be considered to be free speech, whether or not it can and should be regulated. A really great example, and HBO has a documentary on this in particular, is the website 8chan and its role in hosting a large network of QAnon conspiracy theorists, as well as users have posted like live streams of like mass shootings. The shooter in Christchurch, New Zealand was a big example of this. And that's been like sites like 8chan have been like a haven for alt-right networks and other fringe political groups to coordinate and find community and engage in acts that are in speech that I find to be hate speech and inherently anti-democratic. But even beyond that, even something like Facebook, under that telecommunications provision, is largely immune from government intervention, despite the fact that Mark Zuckerberg has been called to testify before Congress multiple times on the role that Facebook has played in disseminating false information during the 2016 and 2020 elections. And that opens up the whole debate as to whether or not something constitutes like fake news. And to my mind, the core problem that social media in particular has contributed to our political system is this erosion of discourse. Rather than like, citizens like engaging in debate and discussion, like in person, being able to like understand the nuances of each other's positions, it's really been like uh, pushed down to this really artificial level of interaction where it's just like through social media comments. Oftentimes you're arguing with people you don't even know. Um, and there is these snap judgments that happen over comments that lack nuance and lack depth and lack context. And you're oftentimes making snap judgments based on a particular person's political ideology. Part of this precedes social media in that it's kind of been part of the American tradition to like not, it's polite to not discuss politics, which is something I find to be terrible. Um, those types of discussions should not just be left to the Thanksgiving dinner table. Like, one of the things I like about the caucus system, and it's the only thing I really like about the caucus system, is that between rounds of voting, you are encouraged to go to other camps for other delegates for candidates you're not supporting and debate with them to try and get them to come over and join your side in the next round of voting. That's fantastic. That's what politics should be, is engaging in these debates as citizens. When I talk to my friends who are on, who ascribe to a different political ideology, I'm able to contextualize their comments. I know like things about like their upbringing, where they work, where they live, the type of influences and background that they have that influence why they believe what they believe. And unless you know that about the other person, unless you're able to like empathize with someone you disagree with, you're not going to be able to find common ground. You're not going to be able to realize, even if someone like, say, voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020, but voted for like Bernie in the Democratic primaries, a lot of people did in the Rust Belt. A lot, if someone posted that on Twitter, they'd be like snap judgments of, you're just facilitating the patriarchy. You're just operating through this lens of white supremacy or whatever else. And that misses the context of someone who might be, economically disenfranchised, who lives in an area that was, heavily built around the manufacturing industry, that lost money after, or lost their job after NAFTA devastated U.S. manufacturing in the 90s. And since then, a long tradition of blue-collar Democratic voters have begun being drawn to this more right-wing populism. But unless you're able to engage in that type of dialogue with someone, those types of like subtleties in why they believe why they vote the way they do, aren't going to be apparent. And you certainly can't get that type of discourse through a Facebook comment thread. But that's just my personal perception of why social media has been harmful to politics in this country.
There are several issues at play here. At the core, I think you and I will agree, from echo chambers and political polarization, algorithmic based, let's say, to anonymous comments online. And we can see now how anonymity manages to mask what you might call embarrassment of being wrong. Not that we should be afraid of embarrassment. Saying that probably makes me think you shouldn't have discourse, but rather the inability for us to grow beyond being embarrassed, right? Beyond being wrong. We haven't developed this skill set, it seems to me. And as younger generations grow up in this, you don't have that skill set. You don't have that. There's a lot of things you don't have, from self-image problems to discourse problems. And so this anonymity and polarization are issues. But then what we're seeing a level deeper seems to be this valuing of alternative news as the default truth by so many of these people you discuss that are starting to lean this populist right, simply because it's ostensibly contrarian. YouTube is a brilliant platform for representing these ideologies.
Yeah, I would agree completely. And I think many on the left have begun to have this distrust of the quote unquote mainstream media as well. And the internet allows everyone, anyone who has a microphone and a webcam to go on and preach, like label themselves as some kind of authority and gain an audience. That can be problematic. That's not to say that we shouldn't be critical of, the mainstream media, for lack of a better phrase, because we absolutely should. To say that there's not bias in that reporting is, laughable, considering that they are competing for ratings. They're competing for viewer attention. When they post on articles on social media, they're competing for clicks. And because many of them are large corporations, they do have their own interests to protect in how they frame specific news stories. I think a really excellent example is, the role of CNN in minimizing, Governor Cuomo's like sexual harassment of multiple women in his administration, and the role that his brother as an anchor played in helping to provide damage control for that situation. The Cuomo's being a longstanding, like wealthy political family in New York. Um, yeah, I'm not sure how we would go about restoring trust in good journalism, because there are so many excellent journalists out there, both within and outside of the mainstream media. But again, social media, you brought up the role of algorithms. Like, what we take in terms of news is so carefully tailored to us as individuals. It is designed so that we are constantly having our own perceptions be affirmed. And when we engage with someone who we disagree with, oftentimes, what the argument that would result from boils down to is both parties would say, you just need to go and do your research. COVID is a fantastic example of this. I have a family member who is a very vocal anti-vaxxer. Up until recently, was a devout QAnon follower. But whenever the notion of vaccines has come up, and I have provided CDC data, I've provided like countless peer-reviewed studies about the vaccinations, like that they're not going to alter your genetic code. The virus isn't hiding in there. It's not a microchip from Bill Gates. You're posting about microchips on your phone on Facebook. Like, the government already knows what you are and what you're doing. Like, it's just silly. But the response that comes back is, oh, you just need to do your research. I've done my research. You need to do your research. And that's critical step of actually going and seeing what is the other side looking at. What is someone I disagree with, like, consuming for news is, something that very few people on any political ideology are really willing to do. But for me, also, the deeper problem is this lack of faith in like peer-reviewed empirical analysis, and not without good reason. In academia, it's easy, regardless of which discipline you're in, it's relatively easy to get funding for a new novel scientific study that you want to pursue. I mean, it's not easy. Like, academics will complain over funding all the time, but it's easier than trying to get funding to replicate that study under the same conditions and make sure that the results are still the same. That is something that is much, much harder to do. So oftentimes when like a study comes out and is cited by, whoever to support their belief, there's not the all too critical work that science requires of replicating that study and making sure that the findings are actually what we claim them to be. And I just want to say, like, there are reasons to absolutely be skeptical of the way science is practiced. It's something that oftentimes produces its own narratives. It's something that, especially in the areas of like healthcare, has been deeply focused on, studies have largely focused on like people who are white and male. People of color oftentimes have higher rates of vaccine skepticism when it comes to COVID, and for very justifiable reasons that aren't like it causes autism. But the history of healthcare for people of color in this country is not a positive one. So, there's a lack of faith in the scientific method and process that is, I think, endemic in this country, and not without good reason for a lot of people. But, what I tell people is to remember that science, good science, is never something that makes claims, this is true. There's no immutable truth that is derived from science. It should always be something that is questioned constantly, over and over, in the spirit of John Stuart Mill, and his belief that we should always interrogate what we consider to be true. Even if that the sky is blue, we should understand why. What's the material composition in the atmosphere that makes the sky blue? Even if we all agree that it's blue, we should know why. Um, if we all agree that the earth is round, which not all of us do, sadly, we should know why. Those things that we just assume, we should always be reinterrogating. Um, and any science that claims itself immune from criticism or immune from like questioning isn't real science at all.
Wrapped up in this goal of falsification in science rather than the goal of proving something true, there seems to be a clear bridge to distrust in the sense that, at least in some domains, let's say you're talking psychology, replication is not only rare, but it's also difficult. And then combine that with, let's say, COVID, for example, where, in all fairness, and I'm someone who is very pro-vaccine, I've been vaccinated for months, it's fair to say that information was being shared very poorly early on in the vaccine, particularly from America, but you could look at the WHO as well. From whether it's Dr. Fauci early on saying we should not be wearing masks when it seems, as far as I'm aware, scientific consensus that would be useful in something like a viral, pandemic, to whatever else, right? Big pharma having hands in certain things, and it leads people to believe things. And I've even been compelled just recently of certain alternatives, right? You look at ivermectin studies presented by someone like Brett Weinstein, who is a respectable evolutionary biologist in my eyes, someone who I've tried to look up to in a number of ways, where these are simply research studies that are very small sample sizes and aren't all that compelling. Maybe it's worth looking into. I mean, the idea of not looking into alternatives during a pandemic seems obnoxious, but it can lead to real problems. And combining that with certain groups that have historical issues with, to your point, certain data, so to speak, in air quotes, then it's really easy for me to empathize why there is so much distrust in something like research, like data, or even COVID vaccines, although I didn't anticipate to this extent.
Yeah, there's a number of issues that play into that. For COVID specifically, you're absolutely right that there was oftentimes contradictory information that was being released by the government during, especially like early on in the pandemic, in no small part because, the scientific community was still grappling with, what we were dealing with. How severe were the symptoms? Like, what was the best way to treat it? And you'll notice over time, the mortality rate in particular has gone down significantly because physicians have developed better treatments for it to mitigate the symptoms. So, the fear of the ventilator isn't something that's as ever present. That having been said, a deeper problem, I think, is that in the US in particular, there's not a lot of scientific education that is mandatory that, requires students to interrogate what it means, like what goes into like a good study. What does it mean? Like, how do you know that the results that you're getting are, something that we can, trust? Like, I took stats classes in undergrad that helped with this, but, when people are posting, various articles or studies on social media, regardless of whether or not I agree with the study's findings, those people aren't looking at things like the sample size. They're not looking at, how the trial was conducted, whether or not like the methods were sound, like if it was like an experiment, like making sure that the control group was like free of contamination from, the actual group. Those are all things that, your average, uncle ranting on social media isn't really interrogating. And that's hard work. That's hard work that goes into that type of research and making sure, like, before you share something, that, it hits certain standards of like reliability to where, we may not, this study isn't like, guaranteed truth, but it's something that we can confidently assume was conducted well. There's always going to be a margin of error. There's always going to be, a degree where there can be variation in what the actual outcomes are. But if a study is conducted well, we can at least have a certain degree of reliance that the findings are valid. Those aren't the types of discussions that people are having. That being said, when it comes to like the vaccines in the US, the studies that were published by the WHO and the CDC as Moderna and Pfizer were getting approval for the vaccines all looked promising. Like they had like many times the number of participants they would normally have in a vaccine study. You know, people wanted to get this right the first time. And that's something that I at least like take to be pretty promising. What's more concerning is like when we inevitably get a variant that ignores the vaccine and decides, you know, we're going back into lockdown, which hopefully won't happen, or at least if it does, like the vaccines will still offer some protection. It's likely we'll still, like everyone who's gotten the vaccine will need a booster in the months ahead. But, you know, that level of interrogation is something that a lot of people just aren't willing to do, or don't have the time to do, or don't have the training to do. And that makes it really difficult. And oftentimes, if they haven't gone through that research and they have to rely on the word of experts, quote unquote, there's additional mistrust there. It doesn't matter how long I've been in grad school, how long I've been studying political science. I have a lot of knowledge about my specific area of research. I have a really strong general knowledge in other areas of political science because I've gone to grad school and had a well-rounded education beyond just my dissertation topic. So I know less than other experts in my field on something like American politics or international relations, but I certainly know more than, you know, crazy Aunt Susan on Facebook. But there's still this level of skepticism that, oh, you've been indoctrinated, you're part of this larger group that seeks to control, yada, yada. And again, that just boils down to, at least in my mind, a deep failure in our education system, whether it's due to lack of funding or whatever else. It's clear that in recent years, there has been a considerable collapse in the quality of our science and civics educations, for sure.
We seem to be unable to delineate, let's say, one small study that has really pretty graphs and it has interesting numbers and through social media algorithms supports our beliefs, which, you know, of course, psychologically we love that. We aren't able to delineate that from something like a large-scale meta-analysis of many different studies that now, if there were confounding variables, they're going to be the edge cases in this meta-analysis. They're not going to be the end-all, be-all. And the problem is, in these most extreme studies, or what purport to be good studies, as far as I can tell, the ones that seem the most radicalized, the ones that promote conspiracy theory, very well may be the edge cases. But if we haven't, to your point, been taught how to distinguish between one set of interesting looking numbers that supports our beliefs and another set that seems kind of scary and disagrees with us, then we're just going to pick the one that fits our narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. A really excellent example of this was the Johnson & Johnson vaccine earlier this summer. There were, at the time that I discussed this with my family, it was 6 deaths. It may have been slightly more since then. But the Johnson & Johnson vaccine contributed to the deaths of 6 women in this country. That was enough for some of my anti-vaxxer family to be like, oh my gosh, like the vaccine is something that's going to kill you. First of all, and then the media picked up on it rapidly as well. Like, you know, it's a headline that's going to get a lot of attention. Like, you know, someone dies from a COVID vaccine. And that's going, you know, and if more people are clicking that link and sharing it on social media, the profit margin for that story goes up. But that lacks the knowledge that, you know, it was a very small number of people. These are outlier cases. It was for one vaccine, not all 3 that have been licensed in the US so far. They all had a similar demographic in that, you know, they were female. It was found that they were all on birth control medication, which already raises the risk of blood clots substantially. And on top of a vaccine that further increases that risk, that's going to be a possible outcome. It's not even a guaranteed outcome if you're a woman and you're on birth control and you get the Johnson vaccine, but that risk goes up enough for 6 people out of, I'm not sure how many, the proportion of how many vaccines have been Johnson & Johnson that have been distributed so far. But it's still it's not a statistically significant impact at all. It's an outlier case, but it's still a headline that's going to grab people's attention further distrust in the vaccine, and you know, and from this outlier case. These are all things that on social media, like, that type of critical thinking isn't something that those platforms like Facebook and Twitter support particularly well.
Our increasingly attention-driven society has managed to either screw up or embrace what was already screwed up in our failure to appropriately understand value propositions. Because that Johnson & Johnson case could have been 1,000 deaths, not 6. Let's say it's orders of magnitude worse. And it's still a significantly lower risk than just getting COVID. I mean, our understanding of value is just wrong. And this is something you see often in unrelated examples like autonomous vehicles. If someone dies in a Tesla in autonomous mode, then that's viewed as the most dangerous thing ever. It's a news headline, and it must be something that we should really stop doing, going towards autonomous vehicles. But if one of the leading causes of death in America is car accidents by us, we don't really care because it's our own autonomy. It's not, an automation autonomy. So again, I don't know if it's something that's made worse because of social media, or if it's just accelerating our degradation, or if it's simply just something we are naturally bad at as products of evolutionary psychology. But we are not good at balancing cost-benefit analyses, and COVID is a wonderful example of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think social media is sort of a straw that breaks the camel's back in this particular instance. A lot of people oftentimes don't have the time commitment to go through and do that initial research. Like, the demands on people's time, for work and education is growing significantly. And, oftentimes we're mentally drained and we are not, able to engage in that type of critical discourse. But for me, a deeper problem is this sort of lack of science education in this country. One of my favorite authors and thinkers who passed in the late 90s was Carl Sagan. He wrote the book Cosmos, and which sparked the PBS TV series. Fantastic, worth going back and watching. And he has a book called Science in the Candle of the Dark, and as a Candle in the Dark. And what he argues in this book is that science is something that is, and science education is something that is integral to preserving the health of a democracy. This was published in, I think it was 1995. And he has a quote from it that I, want to read that I think resonates with a lot of people today. He says, "I have a foreboding of an America in my children's or grandchildren's time, when the United States is a service and information economy, when nearly all the manufacturing industries have slipped away to other countries, when awesome technological powers are in the hands of very few, and no one representing the public interest can even grasp the issues, when people have lost the ability to set their own agendas or knowledgeably question those in authority, when clutching our crystals and nervously consulting our horoscopes, our critical faculties in decline, unable to distinguish between what feels good and what's true, we slide almost without noticing back into superstition and darkness." And that resonates pretty powerfully with, the world that we see today, in which particularly technology has played such a strong role in our political system. It's something where citizens have very little direct control over. One of the pieces that we read at the end of our class, you may remember, was about the role that citizens should play in overseeing social media companies like Facebook and Twitter. And part of what Sagan attributes to this, what he calls the decline in our critical faculties, is this, what he calls the slow decay of substantive content in the media, where 30-second sound bites are now down to 10 seconds or less. Programming is based on the lowest common denominator, like what can get the most clicks and likes, and credulous presentations on pseudoscience and superstition. But what he most eloquently says, a kind of celebration of ignorance. And that's something that we see with a lot of popular figures today. someone like Joe Rogan, I think, is a really good example. Um, on the one hand, I have told like some friends of mine on the left that they were too critical when Joe Rogan endorsed Bernie Sanders in the 2020 Democratic primary, because for me, that opened an opportunity to take a largely, independent to right leaning base of listeners and to engage with, okay, here's why this endorsement is good. This is why, this is some of the value we can gain from this, more progressive politics. But at the same time, Rogan is someone who has a history of inviting, he's invited experts on his show, but he's also invited a lot of pseudoscientists and conspiracy theorists and treated them as if they're standing on equal footing, as if pseudoscience and science are on the same level of credulity, and there's not a lot of critical interrogation that goes on. And when that type of presentation reaches millions of viewers, that contributes to this sort of again what Sagan calls this celebration of ignorance. And that's something that I in my academic work really try to integrate. Like, how can we recover these critical faculties in in everyday citizens, and what are the consequences for democracy if we don't?
So then, is the problem here on the distributor of the information, someone failing to be neutral, or more specifically failing to exercise some critical interrogation, to use your words, or is the failing on the people listening not being able to discern that one set of ideas is much more valid than another, and they're simply projecting those ideas, presenting those ideas on equal footing for the audience, let's say in Joe Rogan's case, to dismantle or praise on their own?
Oh, I absolutely don't attribute blame to the listeners themselves. I think it oftentimes comes down to the fact that information is something that is now treated as a profit-driven commodity, and education as well, right? CU is a really excellent example of this. It receives less than 5% of its revenue from the state, yet it's still considered to be a state institution. And that difference really comes out of, skyrocketing tuition costs in recent years for both in-state and out-of-state students. The access to education, access to, go to an institution where you can help sharpen these critical faculties is something that is now entirely contingent on, the amount of income that you have, for the most part. And as a result, we see these growing cleavages in educational attainment between people who are white and people of color, but more commonly, it's stratified along income level. These interact as well. The more money you have, the easier it is to go to college and have a good education. And even when you go to college, you go to college as a freshman, you're 18, you don't know what you want to be when you grow up. You haven't fully grown up yet, but you don't have the freedom really to bounce around majors and, sample a wide variety of classes to figure out what it is that you want to do. You may be able to get a piecemeal collection of gen eds, but at a certain point you have to pick a major. And if you end up switching partway through, that may delay your graduation by it. And that's another year of, $20,000 to $30,000 in tuition costs, which you may not be able to afford without taking on student loans, which are also part of this profit generating industry. It makes me angry to think about, especially after Nancy Pelosi had her little speech, you wouldn't want to pay for someone else's student loans when her husband has vested stocks in companies that directly manage student loans. That type of conflict of interest is something that's infuriating to me. So I don't blame the listeners. I don't blame the citizens. It's not their fault that they live in a system where information and education is a commodity rather than an entitlement that they should have to, strengthen the quality of politics in this country.
Well, I agree. There's a number of problems with education. I have plenty of firsthand experience with that that major change scenario, the understanding that if you fall behind, your scholarship's only going to go to that fourth year. That's just a reality. And that scholarship, unless you have a full ride, which is relatively rare as far as I can tell, that only covers so much anyways. And then there's obviously the problem of private loans and how their interest rates are astronomical, particularly with people who have no prior credit, which is extremely common, even for individuals who grew up with the expectation of going to college. And that's not even considering large portions of the population where graduating high school is that barrier. You graduate high school, wow, my parents never did that. That's really awesome. It's a different mindset. So access is definitely a huge problem. And then, but to narrow down to the points of free speech, aside from unequal access, let's say, for the sake of this hypothetical question, everyone has some semblance of equal access. What requirement is there for professors, instructors, teachers to not be imparting their own ideologies on teaching? Should you be entirely neutral and accepting that people come from different backgrounds, different socioeconomic statuses, and their interpretations or their understandings will be slightly different, and you don't have the right, let's say, to impede on that? Or is there some kind of value in bringing your own, let's just call it ideology, to your presentation of information? Or is there somewhere in between that information should be spread in a way that's digestible but still has requisite biases?
That's a really, really good question. This is something that, I work every semester that I teach. I work with, my classes on this. You may remember from the start of our semester back in January of this year, we read John Stuart Mill. And one of the things that he talks about in On Liberty is the importance of having educators who are passionate about what they believe. He doesn't ascribe to this ideal that teachers should be, regardless of whether they're in higher ed or whatever, should be totally impartial, that they should adopt this Zen master mentality of not having political affiliations of their own. Because your quality of education will be higher if the people that are teaching you are passionate about what they believe and what they are studying. And I think that's really, really important. I have colleagues who adopt a different stance, who try to be, impartial as part of their teaching philosophy, and that's fantastic. Everyone's, it depends on the class and depends on the material, but everyone's going to have a slightly different style as to what works for them. For me, what's important is that if you are passionate about what you believe and that carries over into your teaching, that you're not discriminating against students who disagree with you. Personally, I think that pretending to be totally impartial is somewhat inauthentic. No one is without predispositions. No one is without bias in certain areas. And to pretend otherwise, I do think has a negative impact on one's education. That being said, you may remember, one of my policies in class is that if the discussion ever turns to, students ask me what I think about a particular free speech issue, I'd always be like, all right, this is what I think. This is the knowledge that I have. You're not being tested on or being asked to replicate what I think. And I think a lot of, there are certainly professors who want to have the material recited back to them, particularly if they have a high course load and are teaching from a textbook, and they're just looking for very easy, demonstrably false or true answers, quote unquote. It's easy to fall back onto a teaching style that assesses whether or not students are able to read a particular paragraph in a textbook and testing on that. That I hate, especially for teaching political theory. I can share my ideas with the class and my thoughts, but I don't want to hear those ideas repeated back to me. I know what I know, and I know what I think. I want to hear what my students think. And that has, at least so far, played out spectacularly well in teaching political theory. It's been, I expected that coming into the grad program, I started teaching my first year of the program in the fall of 2017, shortly after Trump was elected, teaching political science classes in that environment, which in the US was highly divisive, was a little intimidating. But, I adopted this philosophy from day one of, if nothing else, being honest with my students and encouraging them to develop their own ideas. And I've had really positive responses from students, across the spectrum of political ideologies, and encouraging them to, argue for what matters to them. And where I give my feedback is like, evaluating the quality of the sources they're looking at, evaluating the quality of how well they're constructing and supporting their argument. But I never grade any student on whether or not I agree with them or not. I fully agree with John Stuart Mill that there is no ideology that is 100% truth. No opinion is 100% truth. There's always going to be variations and shades of gray in any political issue. And the only way we're going to arrive at what the quote unquote truth is by engaging with other ideas. And that's something I always try and promote. I've had students that, I disagree with on, issues like climate change is a really good one. I've had students write excellent papers on, why, climate change shouldn't result in, the curtailing of civil liberties or like, the moderating of discourse as to like, climate denial, whether or not climate denial should be protected as free speech. I had a lot of students write really excellent papers on why climate denial should be, shouldn't be considered a form of banned speech. And it's excellent stuff. Like, I want students to come out of my classes like with a more well-rounded understanding of their own ideas, as well as ideas that they might disagree with. And that to me is the best way you can have, a class turnout.
Do you feel the same way about media in the sense that there should only be some kind of bias in media, aside from economic reasons in the United States, in that simply looking at raw, neutral information isn't actually tenable? Or do you see a distinction there because something like data may fall outside the lines of neutral opinion pieces?
Media for me is a bit of a different situation for several reasons. A big one is that when you are consuming news media in whatever website or television station or newspaper that may be, nothing is being asked of you apart from engaging with that information. Like, you're not submitting a report to Tucker Carlson or Rachel Maddow about what you listen to and whether or not you agree or disagree with it. There's not that feedback. Furthermore, large media organizations are primarily profit-driven. More often than not, and we talk about this a lot in our class, information is presented in a way that is not going to harm that institution. There's always going to be a filter that's applied to the information that's presented, regardless of whether it's Fox News or MSNBC or whatever else. For me, the media issue is not so much bias in reporting as much as it is the profit motivation in journalism. Because I think that is something that can be harmful when it gets in the way of accurate reporting. That's a really messy issue, especially like, you can't have a news anchor just read off the results of a meta-analysis of different studies because there's not going to be that literacy in the audience. Like, there's this snappy 30-second headline with an infographic that may or may not be oriented along the x-axis the right way. And, there's not that room for contestation and discussion with that. And that's a different issue than like what goes on in the classroom, at least ideally. Hopefully there's no professors at CU that are just presenting terrible graphs and being like, this is it, and without leaving room for discussion. But breaking away that profit cycle of the media and allowing journalism to be its own, like, constitutionally protected, like, entity is something I think is really critically important. And that's something that we're finding to be less and less common as for lack of a better word, the attention span of the consumer has gone down, and it's been compressed to these like little snappy headlines that obscure the facts.
And the obscurantism of these facts, driven, let's say, by our psychology, by social media, by economics, or a mix of all of the above, leads to really interesting examples. Climate change is a great one, as you were just talking about. I remember seeing, let's just say, a Bill Nye debate on Fox News where we talk about climate change, and the arguments against Bill Nye are something to the extent of, well, there's volcanoes on the moon, so how do you know there's not fracking there? And it's just, the arguments are just so nonsensical that my only guess is that these generally well-educated people, because who does high-level journalism? It's people that are fairly well-educated with resources. They're making claims like this. I can't take them seriously. I can only imagine this is, I don't want to say fraudulent, because I'm not calling out Fox in particular here, but at least disingenuous. So it makes me wonder, and let's drill down on climate change here. Is there any danger in, let's say, not just denying climate change, but allowing people to deny it and utilize their particularly American version of free speech?
And we're getting a little closer to my research now, which is great. Environmental political theory is my jam. You know, I think that if we're trying to regulate climate denial as a form of speech, we are trying to put like a Band-Aid over the Grand Canyon in terms of what the actual problem is. Certainly the lack of scientific literacy is a huge problem. But for me, part of the reason why we have such a hard time grappling with the issue of climate change is multifaceted. Part of the skepticism of like climate science is that it's an area where, you know, we're making projections, and there's a lot of variability in those projections. A really good example is, you know, the North Atlantic Current. It is one of the key cycles on this planet that helps, you know, that is key for like agricultural industries, both in the southeastern United States and in Western Africa. It is something that without which there would be a lot of rapidly increasing climate instability. Europe would become a lot colder, and it would have like, I'm not sure if you've ever seen the film Day After Tomorrow, but there would be like silly-sized blizzards. Agriculture in West Africa would collapse. Sea level rise on the east coast of the U.S. would go up substantially. And in recent months, there's been a lot of like warnings that we're hitting a tipping point for the North Atlantic Current. You know, it's slowing down because of climate change. The projections as to when we'd see the worst impacts of that vary between like, you know, 2 or 3 decades and 2 or 3 centuries. That's a lot of variability because we're working with like very imperfect projections. A lot of the extreme weather events that we're seeing now are because of a time lapse, and you know they're largely an impact of CO2 that was released in the atmosphere in like, you know, the late 80s, early 90s, thereabouts. There's a lot of imprecision. There's also a lot of imprecision in assessing like, you know, who's responsible for climate change. Are we looking at historical emissions since the Industrial Revolution? Are we looking at the fact that today 100 corporations are responsible for most of the CO2 emissions that are going into our atmosphere, and we can't really attribute it to one particular country? Those are the types of discussions that muddy climate policy. But for me, the bigger problem, and this is something that I focus on in my dissertation, is that our orientation to nature, broadly encompassing like, you know, the ecosystems of life on Earth, are something that, you know, that rarely affect the reality of what it means to be human. So I trace this all the way back to like John Locke. John Locke is a political theorist who is considered to be the founder of liberalism. Not liberal in terms of like, you know, the, you know, left-leaning AOC type thing, as it's often thought of in the US, but liberalism as, you know, individual rights and liberties, the importance of private property, and representative government. Things that are considered to be foundational for democracy today, even though Locke himself was a constitutional monarchist. In Locke's second treatise of government, he outlines that, you know, we appropriate nature by mixing our labor with it. We acquire it, it becomes ours, we work on it. If you like plant apples and you grow an apple orchard, that is your property. because you worked on it, you've appropriated it for yourself. John Locke has a very Edenic view of nature, in that it's very much like nature is very much like the Garden of Eden. It is created for us as humans. We were designed to have mastery over it, to subjugate it, and to appropriate it for us. And this is, and because of that, it's practically limitless. Like, Earth isn't something that will run out of resources. This was largely like a product of Locke's thinking at the time. Like, he's inhibited by the era in which he was writing. His response to, like, what if we run out of resources, was go to America. There's practically limitless resources there. They're only owned by indigenous peoples. And that has had a long and dangerous trajectory in the history of Western political theory that has subjugated nature to something that is a resource. It's something that we are masters over, and it's not something that we're really dependent on. It's something that we just appropriate for our use. Even Karl Marx, who argued that, or who stated that, nature is an extension of ourselves. It's something that's part of us. It's part of what he called our species being. We're still masters over it. It still exists so that we can, fashion tools and structures out of it and make it into something that is useful for us. And that has a long history, and it's something that's so ingrained in our consciousness now that we can't really see ourselves as dependent on and part of nature. David Attenborough, who is famous, for the Planet Earth series sponsored by BBC, has a relatively new special on Netflix called Life on Our Planet. And he talks about how, since the mid 20th century, the amount of wilderness or non-spaces in nature that, do not have, human interaction has decreased by over 90%. Though we keep appropriating, we keep developing, we keep, building without a sense of sustainability, without a sense of scale, and without a sense that, the resources that we have on our planet are finite. And that has consequences. It sponsors this sort of like fanciful thinking from people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, where we'll just go colonize space. That's something that, A, not possible. We're not going to be able to terraform Mars. And B, it creates this false perception that we have a future that's not on planet Earth. The nearest star to our sun, it would take approximately 70,000 years to reach, based on the speed of our fastest probes that we've sent out into the galaxy, Voyagers 1 and 2. And even if we did manage to make it there in 70,000 years, there's no guarantee that there is a habitable planet around our neighboring stars. So it sponsored this type of fantasy of escapism. And at the same time, it also blinds us to the risks of our incursions into natural spaces. A really great example is COVID. There's, you have the conspiracy theories that it was made in a lab in China, yada, yada. But what people don't consider is the fact that, 20 years ago, the area around Wuhan was, largely uninhabited. It was mostly rainforest. There's a reason why when citizens from the US and Europe travel to more rural areas in like South America and Africa and Asia, we have to get like a bunch of different vaccines, because our immune systems and the immune systems of people indigenous to that area are entirely different. They are prepared for entirely different viruses and our constant interactions with viruses and bacteria. So as we continue to expand, our population grows, we develop more previously wild spaces, build housing developments, and then people have, things like wet markets, where you bring in a bunch of different organisms from a bunch of different habitats, and you have a basic petri dish of viral interactions. Things like COVID-19 and other viruses that are zoologically transmitted are only going to become more common. And that's kind of like nature's way of like pushing back on our overreach. But it's not something that we're really attuned to listen to and incorporate in our political discourse.
Admittedly, and I'm certainly not a virologist, I think the likelihood of something coming from a lab in Wuhan is more than zero. I'm not saying it's 100, but I think that's something that's worth more investigation, not as a ploy from the Chinese government, just because lab leaks happen, conspiracies aside. But that small point aside, you're right in mentioning that we seem to fail, again, just a lack of our human intuition, as I've mentioned a couple times throughout this conversation. We don't really understand our impact and the Earth's reciprocation back on us. We don't really understand the implications of this escapism, as you said. We don't understand the time scale we're talking is in decades or even, let's say, centuries, which, insofar as evolutionary time goes, is minuscule. I mean, absolutely almost finite to the 1 over nth degree. I mean, something extremely small here that I don't even know how to preach enough here, and I'm certainly preaching to a choir. We have to be thoughtful, whether we means everybody or we just means scientists or we means people like you know, researching. We have to be thoughtful of the fact that there are implications to our actions, and nature is the foundation of our entire environment. I mean, it is the backbone of where we exist. And to act as if that's not the case, or to act as if, let's say, terraforming Mars was going to be just a walk in the park, seems to miss the point here.
Yeah, I think that, it's not enough for just like scientists or political officials to have this type of, expanded consciousness to think about, humanity's place as part of nature. But it's something that really it's an ideological shift that, we're all going to have to make in the decades ahead. Um, After, 2030, 2040, some of the harsher effects of the climate crisis are going to come in a lot sharper focus. In particular, water scarcity. It won't be as impactful in places like the U.S., but in other parts of the world, especially the global South, impoverished countries that have long been the victims of colonization, those impacts are going to be a lot harsher, a lot faster. And that brings up, not just the long history of, imperialism and colonialism by the West, but also the fact that, how much loss of life is there going to be before actual change is pursued? And, will it be too late by then? Is the really key question. But I think one of the things that's missing in like the consciousness of like, the everyday citizen is the recognition that humanity, hasn't been here since the dawn of time. And that there's no permanence to us as a, global collective species that's inhabiting the earth. There's no immortality for any of us. And that I think is something that we really don't take time to think about, is the scale at which we've been alive on Earth and the many, many generations after us, where the Earth will continue to revolve around the sun. It will probably continue to support forms of life. The question is whether or not we're going to be a part of that. But there's this inherent anthropocentrism, human-centered thinking in our psychology. And I think it stems back to this like long, Christian tradition of like the earth being made for us being special as a form of creation that's been enshrined in a lot of, political ideology that we don't reckon with fully. And that makes it difficult for us to, consider the needs of generations in the future and not just our own immediate ones. That's not to say it's like, people's fault for not thinking this way. It's just not something that we're really encouraged to do very often. To be a good citizen is to, get an education, get a good job, be productive, to help the economy grow. And there's never this sense that what we've built is precarious or that it might come to an end one day. And that's a problem in our thinking.
We are seemingly not malintentioned, but rather simply apathetic. And to disassociate this from an anthropocentric conversation, I want to tie this into speech, because I have a question for you that was going to sound really strange to a lot of listeners, but it's something you and I have discussed briefly, and you've mentioned in your course. I want to know your thoughts about nature as an entity, or as I don't know what to call it. Let's just say entity until you can clarify for me. Do you think nature has any form of intrinsic rights, or to make this more American, intrinsic free speech?
There is an article, we read it in our class, by Christopher Stone, that was published in 1970. What it was, I want to say it was 78 or 77, later in the 70s. That talks about what it would mean to incorporate speech rights for nature into a political framework. What would it mean for us to legally protect speech acts from nature? And he uses the example of if my lawn starts being discolored, it starts turning brown or yellow, then I know it needs to be watered. It's dying. Much less the fact that lawns are artificial. We don't need them. We should abolish lawns. But that's something we can look to and say, like, this is an element of nature that is in pain. We might look at something like, the apocalyptic skies in California and Colorado last year during wildfire season, where it literally looked like something out of, the end of the earth, blood red skies, raining ash for days on end, and interpret that as a speech act from a dying planetary system. That is something that would be relatively new in American political thought, or Western political thought in general. It is not something that is even remotely new to many, many indigenous political movements in particularly the main ones I'm thinking of are in South America and in New Zealand. In Bolivia, indigenous political groups there helped to incorporate into the Bolivian constitution this notion called vivir bien, or to live well. And what that means was to recognize, like, quote unquote, Mother Nature as an entity, as something that needs to be protected, as something that we are absolutely dependent on in order to continue to survive. That having been said, its enshrinement in the Constitution has not been entirely successful. In South America in particular, natural spaces, especially homes of indigenous communities, are treated as like areas for natural resource mining by multinational corporations. It's why the Amazon is increasingly being cut down and replaced with, palm trees for palm oil. It's really eerie to see, like, the wild denseness of the Amazon suddenly get cut off and replaced with these like rows of trees in grids that are non-native to the area, that have resulted in massive losses of wildlife, trees that offer very little value apart from palm oil industry, which is in our cosmetic products and many other things. And that has significant impacts on the ability of that ecosystem to absorb carbon and to continue to sustain life. And similarly, we commodify nature in very harmful ways. The fishing industry is a really good one to think about too. There's this documentary on Netflix called Seaspiracy that's worth taking a look at, because it looks into the fishing industry as like almost like a kind of mafia. We continue to do massive damage to the ecosystem with like plastic nets. They destroy coral reefs. They absolutely devastate seafloors. They massively disrupt food chains in the ocean. We remove the apex predators like sharks from the ocean. Eventually, species are going to die off. And what we're going to see is a massive growth in organisms like jellyfish that, their natural predators are gone. They can proliferate wildly without those natural predators, and they offer next to no nutritional value to us. And all of a sudden, these ecosystems collapse. And without, the phytoplankton that are in the ocean, that source of carbon absorption is going to die. And if that happens, like, humanity doesn't have a future, like, plain and simple. But I think that it's not so much recognizing nature as something that has speech rights, but what countries in the global north need to really focus on and can learn from indigenous political thought is to not treat non-human nature as this type of commodity, as just a resource that has economic value, when it has such profound implications for not just like, you know, the various non-human species that inhabit it, but for our own like future. And again, that's something that, you know, we struggle to wrap our minds around because it's just not something, it's not an ideology that we really are encouraged to think about very often.
Is it possible that what you're doing is simply taking short-term human-centered selfishness and changing it to long-term human-centered selfishness, in the sense that one is short-term economic gain, one is long-term preferential treatment for our species?
I wouldn't say that it doesn't have to be framed as human selfishness long term. It can be framed as sustainability long term. And, you know, one of the things that in the US in particular, we're really terrible about is like framing it as this like individual responsibility to combat climate change. Don't use plastic bags, yada, yada, when all of that is relatively meaningless in the grand scheme of things. That having been said, there are a lot of things that people can do to lower their personal carbon footprint. Eating vegetarian is a really good one. I personally struggle with that because, you know, I love bacon. But it's something I've tried to be more conscious about. But from the level of like policy, the government can and should do a lot more to do things like implement a carbon tax, focus a lot more on, you know, pivoting, you know, as we go through infrastructure reform, to pivot much more towards public transportation rather than individual car ownership. In the 1950s, when, you know, highways were constructed and the idea of having your own house in the suburb, taking up that much land, and having your own car was part of the American dream, the environmental impacts of that weren't things that were being considered, apart from like a couple quote unquote fringe groups. But even in the 70s, when Christopher Stone published his piece on Speaking for Nature, there was growing recognition of, you know, the dangers of our extractive economy, extractive in terms of like what it requires in terms of resources. And there, for many decades, there were active suppressive efforts to keep that information from being like public knowledge, to keep it from impacting the, you know, profit margins at the end of the day. And we still see that today, with this reticence to curb industries like fracking or fossil fuels. And the reality is we reach the point where we're going to have to accept like some, you know, short-term sacrifices in terms of long-term sustainability. But it's a myth to think that such a thing isn't possible. It just requires reorienting our values. And in many ways, like recognizing that capitalism has done well to get us as far as it has in terms of being a developed political collective. Marx himself argues that capitalism is necessary to help us advance through history. But there comes a time where we can't let it go unregulated, particularly in the environmental sector.
So whenever we're interpreting what I presume you call, let's say, a damaged environmental aesthetic, something that is indicative of a problematic incident or overriding climate change for the worse in our world, are you trying to interpret that as something that's simply an effect of damage we're presenting that's being conveyed to us, or are you presenting this as raw consciousness? There is a inherent willpower to those leaves of those blades of grass that are turning brown, something we should have guilt about for cutting the lawn, or are you simply saying this is just the effect that conveys to us there's problems afoot that we need to address?
More so the former. I think that overall we need to have a wider respect for non-human life. There's a lot of really interesting work that's being done on, you know, plant intelligence, fungi especially. It's really fascinating the way that there's like forms of communication between different species in that area. But where I focus on, at least in my work, is capturing that aesthetic experience and the impact it can have on shaping our political ideologies. Immanuel Kant has this notion that he calls the sublime. He didn't come up with it. It has a long history in aesthetic thought, but he's someone who tried to make it political. And the sublime is something that we encounter in nature or in the external world that shocks the cognitive faculties of the subject viewing it. So a really good example is something like walking along the ocean. Like, so you're walking on the beach. There may be a storm coming in. You hear the waves crash. You hear and see the waves crashing, and you're overwhelmed not just by the power of nature in that moment, but by its perceived infinity. You can't see where the horizon ends. You don't know how deep the water is. It's something where you're just kind of lost and overwhelmed in this moment. Similarly, like going back to the examples of like the skies in California and or in the American West, last year during the fire season. Those moments that make you like look outside your window and think, "Holy shit!" Like something that interrupts your cognitive processes, that kind of shocks your ability to like rationalize what it is that you're seeing. And in those moments, there's profound potential for us to rethink the political judgments that we have, to make us take a second guess and consider, all right, what does this mean? What does this mean for me? What does it mean for us as a community? How do we go about fixing it? It doesn't all have to be negative. One of my favorite examples, and one that kind of sparked this dissertation project for me, was thinking about the sublime in relation to what's called the pale blue dot. The pale blue dot is a famous picture that was taken by the Voyager 2 probe as it passed Pluto's orbit in like the late 1980s. At the time, Carl Sagan was working with NASA in the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. This was at the time when NASA was being increasingly defunded. You now see that it's largely just an arm for SpaceX today. And he and several others were trying to petition to radio commands to the Voyager probe to get it to turn around and take a picture of Earth from its distance. They had to fight really hard for that to happen because it wasn't viewed to be like something that would be beneficial. But they eventually won the petition. They radioed the commands, and then several days later, it was able to turn around and snap the picture. And several days later after that, we received it. And it's just this tiny little speck of blue in like the midst of a sunbeam. From comparatively, it's not taken from that far away, like just at the edge of the heliosphere, or where the sun's gravitational pull ends. Not that far, but even then, all of our national borders and boundaries, the history of our species, everyone who ever lived or died, was contained in that little tiny blue speck floating through space. And that's an example of the sublime that should at least make us think, holy shit, this is it. What we have right now, here today, is it. It's what matters. And it helps us to kind of set aside a lot of these sort of like superficial, conflicts that we have today. And in the era of social media, a lot of the debates that we have, I think, are largely superficial and seek only to just generate attention. That's the type of thing that I want to consider people to think about in their consciousness. Like, what does it mean for us to be like, what Carl Sagan calls like children of the cosmos? Like, he casts it in almost a very spiritual way. Like, the atoms that comprise our body were all like born in the heart of stars. Like, it's something where we have an obligation to learn more about the universe, absolutely. But with that comes the obligation and knowledge that this Earth is it. This is a thing that, we have to protect. And at the end of the day, we have to protect it not just for our own sake, but for the sake of future generations that are going to come after us. And unfortunately, today, I'm at the point, knowing what I know about climate science and what the future of life on this planet is going to look like in the decades ahead. Many of my friends who are in their early 30s are, just having kids. And I'm happy for them. But in the back of my brain, there's this little like, oh, that kid's going to have a rough time when he hits 2030. And all of a sudden, there are mandates as to how much water a person can use and things like that. Or summers are going to be a lot hotter. And, it's going to get worse before it gets better. And that's something that's difficult to shake from the back of my brain. But it's something we have to think about.
Well, on that note, let's leave it on a sublime optimism rather than the nihilism that could present itself from the sublime. I think that's a powerful image for the negative or the positive, but at least for the sake of optimism, insofar as we require it to have any motivation to not destroy what we have. That's a really powerful thought. So let's leave it at that. I appreciate you coming on and talking with me today, Matt. It's always great to talk to you. I love to learn, and you're someone who has a lot to share, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. We talked about like a whole bunch today, so I appreciate we were able to cover so much in such a short space of time.